Okay. Okay, so we'll start in the beginning a few words in Hebrew, and then we'll commence with our meeting in English. Okay, that's for the Tel Aviv University and the people in Israel. ערב טוב קהל נכבד, הספרייה המרכזית על שם סורסקי שמחה לפתוח את הערב עם מפגש נוסף בסדרה פורום ספרים וסופרים. פרויקט משותף של המרכז לחקר ארצות הברית בשיתוף תוכנית פולברייט, אוניברסיטת תל אביב, בניהולו של דוקטור יואב פרומר, שהוא כמובן גם המראיין היום, ובשיתוף עם הספרייה שלנו. זוהי סדרת מפגשים עם חוקרות וחוקרים ישראלים ואמריקאים על ספרים חדשים שהוציאו בנושא ארצות הברית. סדרה מצליחה שמתקיימת פעם בסמסטר, שיש לה צופים רבים בפייסבוק וביוטיוב. הערב אנחנו גאים לשוחח, הפעם בשפה האנגלית, עם ההיסטוריון ג'פרי לוין מאוניברסיטת אמורי שבאטלנטה, על ספרו החדש שיצא לאור בנובמבר בייל יוניברסיטי פרס, על ההיסטוריה של מחלוקת יהודית אמריקאית לגבי ישראל בשנים 1948 עד 1978. נושא שהוא האמת גם רלוונטי היום לאור מה שמתרחש עכשיו בזמן המלחמה בעזה, והתגובות של הקהילות היהודיות בארצות הברית למלחמה אוקיי, אז אני עכשיו עוברת לאנגלית. So, okay, now in English. Hello and good evening, dear audiences in Israel and in the United States. The Elia Sourasky Central Library at the Tel Aviv University is delighted to open
Judith,
Yeah?
יש איזה תקלה, לא כל כך שומעים אותך, הווליום.
אתם לא שומעים.
עכשיו כן, את יכולה להתחיל מחדש באנגלית, עכשיו זה בסדר.
Okay, so hello. And good evening, dear audiences in Israel and in the United States. The Elia Sourasky Library, Central Library at the Tel Aviv University is delighted to open the evening with a further meeting of our book forum series, a project of the Center for the Study of the United States in partnership with the Fulbright program at the Tel Aviv University and our Central Library here. In our meetings, we engage in conversations with Israeli and American researchers about their recently published books on the subject of the United States. The writer of this book being American, the event today will be held in English. So we are pleased and excited to speak today about the history of American Jewish descent over Israel with historian Geoffrey Levin, Assistant Professor of Middle Eastern and Jewish Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, and the Director of Undergraduate Engagement at Emory's Tam Institute for Jewish Studies. His interests include Middle Eastern politics, modern Jewish history, U.S. Middle East relations, and the histories of Israel and Palestine, which we will, of course, see in the book. Also, U.S. Middle East relations. Okay, I don't know if I said that. His writings have appeared in many scholarly journals, Israel Studies Review, Arab Studies Journal, American Jewish History, Israel Affairs, and also in the Forward, Daily Beast, and The Atlantic. Geoffrey Levin's compelling book, Our Palestine Question, Israel and American Jewish Descent, 1948 till 1978, was published recently by Yale University Press. Although it focuses on the early decades of the State of Israel, it is also relevant to what is happening today in wake of Israel's war with Hamas in Gaza and the hostages held here. And of course, the reactions of Jewish communities in the States to this. And of course, we will talk about this later. Just to tell you, the meeting is broadcasted on Facebook and YouTube and will last 1 hour until 7 Israeli time. Please use the Facebook or mail of the center for writing your questions, and Geoffrey Levin will gladly answer them at the end of the meeting. Thank you. And now to Dr. Yoav Frumer, Director of the CSUS, the Center for the Study of the United States.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for all our audiences joining us both on the Zoom and on YouTube. It's always a pleasure to do these book forums, right? But I know both myself and Judith, we always look forward to the chance to engage in this new conversation, and we're certainly thrilled that Jeff was able to join us, especially because I can't think of a book that is more timely today than his book. There's so much to get to, but I want to really, before we go back in time, I want to start with the present, because this is history, right? This is kind of, it's a history that's in the making in a way. And I want to maybe start with a general question, and it has to do with what we've been seeing in the last few months. And one of the things that we've seen, certainly in Israel, but I've also seen this in the American press, in the American Jewish press, is a sense of I would call it shock and awe that so many of the demonstrations are actually led and organized by Jewish organizations, right? Jewish Voices for Peace, probably the most prominent, right? And all the big sit-ins, Grand Central Station, and certainly at the beginning of the war, these were conducted by primarily Jewish American activists and Jewish American organizations. And there was a really incredible sense of astonishment that you could sense in the Israeli press, but also among quite a few Jewish Americans who really couldn't believe, in that sense, how could this be? And in that sense, I think Jeff's book is so important because it shines a light on something that shouldn't be that surprising in a way, right? And I think that's part of this really important contribution to our understanding and to revising, and maybe even to shattering certain myths about the Jewish American community's relationship to Israel. So I think maybe if we could start, Jeff, in your, this has been a very kind of meticulous historical investigation. Can you maybe just lay out the basic premise of your book and your findings when it comes to the long history, and it is a long history of Jewish American dissent over Israel?
Yeah, thank you, Judith and Yoav. The present moment, I'm thinking constantly about everyone affected in all these ways by this war, displacement, captivity, death, and mourning, and Israelis, Palestinians, and others. It just the book connects in so many ways, even though this is decades ago, especially about discourse in America, which has been such a big focus. I'd say there are three main really takeaways and areas of focus in the book. One is the most simple, which is that American Jewish discomfort or protest or whatever you want to frame, engagement with Palestinian rights issues and Israel goes back to 1948. There's this idea that this is something new, that, this generation, or, the 60s and 70s generation, that it began then. And the truth is, as long as there have been Palestinians displaced, as long as there have been, Arabs living under military governments initially after 48, there were American Jews who felt that didn't suit their ethical vision of whether to talk about American liberalism or about their notion of what it meant to be Jewish politically. The second point is that this occurred in a context of a lot of state involvement. And I focus especially on how Israeli diplomats were responding and guiding early American Jewish narratives about the refugee issue, about other issues. But I also talk about the CIA, which is surprisingly a central player in this sort of behind the scenes. And part of the reason that American Jews were mobilizing in the 50s in the way they were was because of these Arab League-backed and CIA-backed initiatives to raise the refugee issue. So on one hand, that's on the side, but on the other hand, it's sort of behind the scenes mentioned and everything. And so that sort of answers some questions about why American Jews didn't engage in these issues earlier in ways that some may have expected. And the third main piece is something that I think has become a lot more important since October 7th to me, is how American Jews engaged with these issues of when and how anti-Zionism constitutes anti-Semitism. Does anti-Zionism, when is it anti-Semitism? When is it not? Does Zionism have the potential to increase anti-Semitism? And so there's this arc in my book about the American Jewish Committee and about Arab activism in the 50s that shows that the discourse about this was very different 60, 70 years ago, but sort of shows and historicizes how that changes. So I really put those three things forward as the main takeaways.
So just a follow-up, and then Judith, I know he has a lot of questions as well. So the follow-up, can you maybe just because the book just came out, by the way, and I certainly recommend reading it. But maybe if we could flush out some of the main characters, because it's remarkable how I think most, certainly American Jews, but not only, there's certain names that we recognize that are part of our of our kind of cultural memory. People like Saya Kenan, right, kind of the founder of AIPAC, and like Abba Hillel Silver, and Stephen Weiss, Rabbi Stephen Weiss, and we know these figures very well because they were extremely important in persuading and lobbying the United States government on behalf of Israel, and being pro-Israel and very Zionist and so forth. But all of these characters, who many of them are quite remarkable, that Jeff kind of uncovers and returns into history, have been either forgotten or erased. I think you used the word sidelined, right, kind of in the book. Can you tell just because there's quite a few of them, but can you maybe just mention a few of the main figures who, when we think about the history of dissent over Israel, who are they, kind of, and what was their contribution to this kind of alternative attitude toward Israel?
Okay, so before you answer, I just want to add to this, because that was actually my first question. It's about Don Peretz. And, it's like in your book, you write about all kinds of American Jewish individuals, organizations, American rabbis like Elmer Berger, Arab individuals, and all of them engaged one way or another with supporting the Palestinian plight. And really one of them was Don Peretz, who is like slightly forgotten, even though we have a lot of books and articles of him in the university. You commence the book with him and you end it, and he appears all through the book. And there are also photographs and everything. And could you tell us about him, his connection with Israel, his visits there? He came there already in 1949, his engagement with the Arab population, all kinds, with the AGC, with the Jewish newsletter. And and also after this, I would also very much like you to tell us, that's what I felt, your special relationship with this Don Peretz. You probably investigated him and wrote about him, and he's a very interesting and remarkable character. So,
these sort of special relationships. So 5 out of the 6 chapters focus on 1 or 2 people, and they're generally people that even experts in the field haven't really heard about in a substantive way. People have maybe heard his name. So the subject of the first chapter, he's the closest thing that the book has to a main character, is this guy, Don Peretz. And fascinating life. His father was Sephardic, from a long-standing Sephardic Jerusalemite family. And his father's family, Chaim Peretz, was born in 1894 to a Zionist, Sephardic family who had lived, again, in Eretz Israel for 400 years. And his father flees, friends with Aaron Aronson, and flees during the Ottoman Empire during World War I, ends up in Baltimore, is friends with Henry Ebed Zold, and is very active and a staunch Zionist, marries an Ashkenazi American Jewish woman, and has Don Peretz, this one child, in October of 1922. And Don still has cousins, or there are still relatives of his in Israel, because his father had a number of siblings. Of course, it's hard to track down Peretz's because it's such a common name. So he grows up born in Baltimore. He grows up in Queens, and in New York, and becomes very interested in pacifism, and works with this Quaker group called the American Friends Service Committee in the U.S., interested in the Jewish Peace Fellowship and Jewish pacifism. And he is willing to get drafted in World War II refuses to carry a gun. So he's a Japanese translator, and he's very affected, though, when he's over there by how about the war. And he's inspired by his father's background and by people like Judah Magnus and Martin Buber, that after the war, he goes to graduate school at Hebrew University. So he's in Jerusalem from 46 to 48. And he has a remarkable stretch, all these letters I found. His widow, I spoke to him on the phone once, but his widow let me see all of his papers. So all these letters that no one had looked at to his family. And I recount this person's trajectory. He becomes so inspired by Zionism while he's there in Jerusalem. His father had been Zionist, but he never really got it. And he falls in love, really, with Zionism, but he's a Magnus follower. And so when the war breaks out, he's torn apart. And he thinks Magnus is the only solution, by nationalism is. And then he dramatically gets abducted by some Arabs in Jerusalem, and it becomes international news in Jerusalem Post and New York. But they let him go when they find out his politics. And he becomes very interested in Arabs, and he meets with Magnus. In his final months, he has this dramatic moments where he meets Begin during the Altalena affair, just like all this kind of Forrest Gump style situation. He leaves in the new state of Israel in June of 48, but he comes back to join the Quaker delegation that's helping displaced Arabs in the Galilee. And so he spends most of 49 really helping sending food and aid to, again, these are internally displaced people who become citizens of Israel, but most of the Quakers were helping refugees in Gaza. He then goes through a PhD program and he writes this book. So he writes the first dissertation that's published anywhere. And so the first really, quote, objective scholarly study as a PhD
we have
student
this at the university. I saw it. We have it. I'm very proud that we have it.
Yes. It comes out in 58. The dissertation came out a few years before that. It's before Roni Gabaz, which is the second that comes out a year later. And it's actually, he doesn't think that mass refugee return is viable. But he is sort of wants this to be objectively studied. And this major organization called the American Jewish Committee, which AJC, still around now, hires him to help have a refugee aid initiative. And so a lot of my story is this American Jewish Committee, which maybe I'll get back to in a minute because I want to answer Yoav's questions about the other people and about how, his story, how he's working with them, why they're getting involved in this, and what Israeli diplomats are responding to it. So he's the focus. Another person called William Zuckerman, a Yiddish journalist who writes in English, who writes very sort of critically about Israeli issues in the 50s, is the subject of the next chapter. Also, someone who gets the attention of Abe Harman, who's a major diplomat, and even Sharet writes with him, this very controversial journalist who's, again, talking about the Palestinian refugees throughout the 50s and early 60s. A chapter that deals with the American Jewish Committee focuses on, if people know Louis Marshall, the major sort of American Jewish leader, his son is trying to get Ben-Gurion to change the policies toward Israel's Arabs during the 50s when there's military government. And so chapter 3 deals with him and that, and trying to push Israel to liberalize its policies. Another chapter is on a Palestinian, or someone who's half Palestinian, a guy named Fayez Sayegh. And so and how the American Jewish Committee engaged with him, pro-Palestine rhetoric during the Suez crisis, and all these secret meetings and conversations, including stuff between AJC and Ben-Gurion about him. Some chapters on anti-Zionist Rabbi Elmer Berger. And then the last chapter gets into the 70s, where I'm talking, which you can't focus on one person because there's so many people in the 70s who are interested in this after, the 6-Day War. So that's a lot of people. So I can, of course, say more, but I want to send it back to you for more specific questions.
So just because I just want to help some of the audience who haven't read the book, right? So each and every one of these individuals, I want to be too careful. I don't want to overgeneralize, but in a way, each of them, right, voices a certain concern for Palestinians and especially the refugees, right? That seems to be a very salient part of their attitudes towards the conflict, that Israel has to, try to resolve somehow, or at least recognize the challenges, both the practical but also the moral, right, that are involved in the refugee question. And this is after 48, before 67, right? That's kind of what. And these are the initial actors, right? And I think what struck me about all, and these are different people, and some of the, the AJC, which, right, you mentioned, to this day, it's one of the most important organizations. We've done some events with them, right? They do some great stuff in terms of research also and polling. But even the AJC, which today I don't think anyone would suggest is a non-Zionist, right? That's how they were defined, as non-Zionist, at least before 67, right? So even the AJC is quite skeptical and I don't know, maybe neutral, or they try to remain neutral, at least in those first 2 decades after 48, right? And all of these different individuals, they either, they're either voicing certain conservative Palestinians, or they're cautious about embracing Israel too much. Well, is there anything, what motivated them, right? Is it just kind of moral stuff? Or a lot of that has to do also with domestic politics, I think, and their place as Jews in America at that moment in time, right? So maybe you could speak to some of the motivations behind all of these individuals and organizations that called themselves non-Zionist or however.
Yeah, some of this is moral, and reasons, for liberalism that they embrace, or being consistent, either about general American politics, secular politics, or their Jewish identity. But there's also always this context of the domestic scene. And whenever American Jews are talking about Israel-Palestine, they're not just talking internally. They're also talking in a context where they're surrounded by Christians, by sometimes Arabs, sometimes other sorts of people. And so there's a lot of concern during the 50s about the ways in which these questions are being brought up by American Christians who are starting to talk about these issues. They expect American Jews to be saying something, or expect their liberal, American Jewish partner organizations to be just saying or doing something, or the concern that maybe this, what they term as Arab propaganda from the Arab governments that's coming in about these issues, maybe that will foment anti-Semitism, because the white supremacists, right-wing anti-Semites are using some of this stuff. Oh, look what happened at Kafar Qasim, in their, literally in their publications in, 1956, 57. So that is something that leads them, because they're kind of stuck, these organizations, because they've really talked about embracing liberalism and embracing a vision where minorities are protected and where people who are displaced are taken care of. And then when you have other people pointing them out, they feel a need to take action. And that's why they take action in the mid-50s and not right afterward. The other important thing is they talk about the refugees, but the third chapter about the AJC talks a lot about Arab rights in Israel. So, Arabs who remained in Israel got citizenship a few years later, but not everyone is totally aware of how many restrictions that they faced in the 50s. They even Begin opposed by the late 50s because it benefited Mapai. And the AJC was forced to confront this. And, they position themselves not just as a Jewish group, but as a liberal human rights organization. So, and people are talking about this. It's not something they can hide. So they talk to Ben-Gurion and try pushing Ben-Gurion. And they have these fascinating conversations, and they send memos, and they are working on it. But it's, for some people, again, looking at people's papers, I can see for this person, it's really maybe a moral question and about his Jewishness, and for this person, it's because we don't want to look bad in front of your, Christian friends. So it's hard to say what's motivating an organization when different people have different motives. But I think they're all important.
Yes, but they had a lot of, Israeli diplomats, they did so much to act against them. They wanted all kinds of, even Don Peretz and all kinds of individuals to resign from AGC and or to get fired. So Israel was very much always on the lookout who was against them you know, and always trying. So, you know, I would also like you to tell about all the ministers and also the Ben Gurion, you know.
Yeah, no, I mean, these were high up. So these little people who you've never heard of, the Israeli diplomats obsessed over them. People like Don Peretz and people like William Zuckerman, and not little, just no one diplomats, people who became people, like Abraham Harman, who's, you know, daughter of Chazan, but who was the head of Hebrew University, was like a major,
the great ambassador.
Tel Aviv, you know, was Tel Aviv, it's this major figure. He's central to this undermining of American Jewish voices. And they have to push the American Zionists to take them on. This writer, William Zuckerman, was getting very high circulation for his newsletters and his material that's critical of Israel. And this is 1950. So, and so these diplomats who became ambassadors, including, you know, Harman, who became ambassador to the US, are saying he's confusing Zionists. You know, we need to get, so they push the American Zionists to work against them, which is fascinating because there's always this idea that, you know, and there is, I think, generally now, they don't need the encouragement. And they push people get fired. Other people like Esther Hurlitz, who's a protege of Sharet, you know, again, the prime ministers even make a little debut here and there with this. So this is, you know, I really try and get the quotes in there because it's like they want to like dig him a grave for his career at certain point.
So can you come back, just because that line that struck me, and of course that's one of the great quotes that you have with I think it was Levin, right, one of the Israeli diplomats, writing about, I think it was Zuckerman in the Jewish newsletter, and he's saying, you got to stop this guy, right? He's confusing. He's right, that word, he's confusing kind of American, you know, Zionists. And it's remarkable. And for me, as an Israeli, of course, I felt discomfort because you revealed there such a level of, of interference, I suppose, well, you know, of them. Every op-ed that suddenly comes out where someone's mentioning Palestinian refugees or anything like that, you see how vigilant they are, right? In the sense that just that, you know, that came out somewhere, and I know, you know, we have to stop him, and the pressure that they're applying in order to get these people silenced or even fired. You know, for me, it kind of, I knew about this. I've seen these records in the archives, but still, there's something. The question is that why? Right? Why was it for them so urgent? And this, I think, this line where he says, "You got to silence them. They're confusing the American Jews." What did he mean by that? I mean, why did the Israeli diplomats, in your opinion and in your findings, find these individuals who were voicing dissent over Israeli policies? Why were they deemed so dangerous for the Israeli state?
You know, one example is an op-ed said there were 700,000 refugees, and the diplomats like, oh no, there were only 500,000 Arab refugees, and we know there were more than. I mean, this is a period where American Jews are so important to Israel. You know, Israel just had, you know, doubling its population with, you know, olim from Arab countries and from other places, and there's a massive need for money. There's a need for diplomatic support. They know that the Truman and Eisenhower would really like there to be some refugees returned, or like to pressure Israel, maybe even to give a little bit of land to Egypt. And so this is before there's any like Christian evangelical lobby. This is before Israel has any money. You know, this is, you know, petit team time.
Yes, but still there is no difference today. I'm sorry, it's the same today.
No. I mean,
I have to say
it is. Yeah. You're right. There's still this obsession, but I think you look at Peretz and his plan. He didn't want refugee return. He wanted maybe 50 or maybe 50,000 or something. You look at the AJC. They weren't about to, you know, declare a war. They were helping Israel in so many ways. You know, it's not like they're working against these sort of fringe anti-Zionists. Even Zuckerman, he calls himself pro-Israel at the beginning. He still calls himself pro-Israel. And so I think controlling the narrative, they felt, was just so essential. I think your question, I'm so focused on the historical context, Judith. I'm not, maybe I'm, Judith,
No,
you're not
it's
thinking
okay.
about,
We have a difficult situation now, so I'm sorry. I didn't want to.
But also these were, often liberal-minded people in a lot of ways. This was the Mapai establishment, who had, at least if you idealize them, maybe. And they were compelling in so many ways to American Jews, actually, more compelling than diplomats. Israeli diplomats are diplomats, are today. But no, it's fast. One of the diplomats, by the way, is Yaakov Morris, who the father of Benny Morris, who's one of the one who gets, so because this first book on the Palestinian refugees was too controversial for Yaakov Morris. He was one of the people who got Peretz kicked out. So any follow up on that or quite a question?
So I maybe just to follow up on that, if we're thinking about the state and the role of the state, so obviously we see how the state of Israel through its diplomatic corps is very involved in this and trying to silence a lot of these voices, right? Very aggressively, I must say. But there's also the other side of that coin, I think, is, and this is also very surprising, I think, would be to many, is the American government, right? Especially the CIA, and the State Department, right? And can you maybe talk? And here, really, just I think we need to acknowledge you, right? You, Wilford's wonderful work on the history of the CIA, and he's helped uncover some of this stuff. And it's the involvement of the CIA in backing some of these organizations, whether it's kind of the American Friends of the Middle East, which is probably the most famous and influential, but a lot of the anti-Zionist kind of Jewish organizations like the American Council on Judaism, right? Why were they involved? Why is the CIA, right? The CIA, right? Why are they funding these elements which are very critical, even hostile of Israel? That is an important part of the story in the 50s, I think, that also people need to realize. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I should say what I can take credit for and what I can't. I haven't been in sort of government archives. Other scholars have done sort of work saying, what the CIA is doing, but I've sort of seen where the money has gone. For example, saying that the CIA paid for this book by the Arab League, former official, like it said here, they got a grant from American Friends of the Middle East, or that they founded, the CIA money founded the first Arab student group in the United States. Right. The CIA funded, like American Friends of the Middle East published this book from this anti-Zionist rabbi. So I sort of make these connections and say, wow, like so much of this was done. I mean, a lot of it probably would have happened anyway. These people genuinely had these feelings, but without all that money, how much would have it happened? This is a time when sort of the Protestant non-Jewish elite are still running foreign policy, especially covert foreign policy, in the 40s and 50s, and American Jews sort of get into that realm only more so in the 60s and beyond. And the feeling is from the 40s is that supporting Zionism is not in America's interest. There's the oil issue, especially, but the relationships with the whole Arab world, and that there needs to be more space for pro-Arab positions in America so that the government has more of a free hand to pressure Israel. We're not talking after 48 about destroying Israel, but about saying, okay, maybe we need to pressure Israel and Egypt into some agreement that would maybe involve Israel ceding a little territory and accepting some refugees. And so this is a faction within the government, but they're very well connected under the Eisenhower years. The Dulles brothers, one's heading the CIA, one's the Secretary of State. Eisenhower's reverend, his church is on the 5-member board of this American Friends of the Middle East Front Orient. So this is very high level stuff. And it sort of tapers off. AFME doesn't go away, but it tapers off only when America kind of in the late Eisenhower years loses faith in its ability to really befriend Nasser and Egypt. Because anyone who I'm maybe not going to go into all the history of that, but when after the revolution of 52, America had, high hopes that some American leaders had high hopes that there could be a strong relationship, but that falls apart for sort of complex Cold War reasons and because of Nasser not wanting to be feeling like a lackey of the US. And so the CIA is, again, its money is going to the organization that's the most vocal pro-Arab voice in American discourse. And the second most vocal voice that emerges are sort of Arab students and Arab diplomats and Arab figures. And a lot of them had some connection or received support at different points in their careers from this money too. So it's kind of nuts. And some American Jews who are anti-Zionist are involved with it. But this is something that, hasn't been studied until very recently.
Judith, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I would like to, first of all, I would like for you, if you can shortly tell us something about okay, I'm a woman, so I'm interested in gender. And you wrote a little about a few radical Jewish women who were active, right? Sharon Rose. And could you tell us a little bit about it? And afterwards, I think I would, I would like to talk about Brera, about that came in the 70s, and so could you
Great.
just
I definitely regret that there aren't more women with a central role in my book, and a big part of that is because women aren't traveling or allowed to as freely or as much in the 40s and 50s, and are not really allowed to advance. The American Jewish Committee didn't have any, they had one woman staffer who is very well known, Lucy Davidovich, but in general, there's just not in these non-Zionist AJC or anti-Zionist circles. The women that come out in these pre-67 period are actually either they're not Jewish or they're not American. So people like Esther Hurlitz, the Israeli diplomat, is a woman. People like Dorothy Thompson, who's an anti-Zionist American woman, who's Jewish. But after 67, you get many more voices. And so I do try and focus a little bit on a couple of them. Two American Jewish women who are both of sort of a liberal background, born in the early 40s, and consider themselves radical ultimately, and go to Israel at different times in the 60s. And in two ways, some similar, but after 67, they go in the opposite direction. One becomes a radical Zionist and says, the left has turned its back on Israel, so we need to show you can be a good radical, a good leftist, and a good Zionist. And her name is Aviva Cantor. And I showed Sharon Rose, who goes the opposite direction and says, okay, this Israel doesn't make sense. She looks at the anti-Mizrahi sentiment. She looks at what she views as Palestinian stuff. And she becomes a strong anti-Zionist voice in the 70s. So
they were both in Israel? I don't remember one of them.
They both spent time in Israel.
Okay.
They both studied abroad in Israel at different points in there. But again, one became a Zionist, then one became an anti-Zionist, even though you would think they would, on paper, they're so similar, and they were in certain ways before. So I talk about a few women in that context. Do you want me to talk about Brera, which kind of comes directly out of that?
I think yes, because it's like
Maybe just remind us because that also, as all these characters have totally been forgotten in history, and also you redeem them and you help reintegrate them into the narrative. So maybe say something about Brera as an organization, I think, and that would
be sure. So I talk again about these women and all these little radical groups that come up right after 67. So I don't need to tell you about what happens in 1967 in the Middle East, but in the United States, it's when, yes, exactly. But in the United States, most of you probably know this too. It's the first time the new left, Black power groups, other leftist groups really embrace the Palestinian cause, and it's a shock for a lot of American Jews. And again, it leads to these reactions, Jews going in different directions. And then after 73, when Israel seemed to have it all together, but after the 73 war, this new group emerges called Brera, kind of a response to Ein Brera. basically trying to argue that Israel has a choice, that American Jews have a choice. And it's known, people have written about it before. But the way I write about it in my last chapter is sort of a culmination of things that came before, and also as an entangled story. So I am trained as a historian of the Middle East and Israel, not as an American Jewish historian. And so I approached the issue from a different way. So this emerges in late 73, and it's the first sort of group to argue in America nationally, Jewish group, to argue for what we call the two-state solution now. It says, Israel needs to support Palestinian self-determination because of all the issues that you know about. This has become commonplace, but it was new and radical back then, especially when you're talking about the PLO. And I show that, these people aren't so influenced by the American left, not only influenced by the American, but also by Israel. All these founders had spent time in Israel. And they were shaped by people like Reuben Kamenar and like all these sort of left-wing Israelis. Mati Peled is a big...
Yeah,
Urav Neri.
Yeah.
Urav
Meir
Neri.
Pail, a lot of them.
Meir Pail. Yes, Yoav Peled, who was involved in Brera, he was an employee of Brera at the end.
Really, Yoav? Our Yoav Peled, the town?
Yes, you're Yoav Peled. I interviewed him and I used his papers.
And they also had like there was David Shacham, who is
David Shacham,
writer and author.
All these people that but the Americans don't know.
Yes.
They were talking about and thinking, and they're why these American Jews were shaped by the politics they were. And it actually wasn't that controversial initially, but what was a major turning point happened in 76. So Mati Peled and Urav Neri and others had this organization called, in English, it's the Israeli Palestinian Council for Israeli-Palestinian Peace, or Israeli Council for Israeli-Palestinian Peace. And they met with two PLO members, Issam Sartawi and Sabri Jurius. Sabri lives in Israel now even, but they're the more moderate figures in the PLO, and they're trying to negotiate. And they're reporting back to Rabin, even though they're not major players, Evneri and these others, and Peled. But then American Jews meet with these two PLO people in the US, and it becomes hugely controversial because some Israeli diplomat leaked that this meeting happened because someone reported to him. And so all the other groups who were involved in these meetings distanced themselves, even though secretly Nahum Goldman met with them and met with them. But Brera said, it's okay. We should be meeting with PLO moderates. We should be meeting with the PLO. And of course, this is the time when the PLO is like, the reputation of the PLO is like Hamas is today, almost. Well, not today, maybe before October. It becomes extremely criticized and ultimately falls apart. There's lots of reasons for that, but it's a major reason. And so from their perspective, they were just following Mati Peled and following the Urav Neri and the Israeli left. But they were viewed as Jews for Fatah was kind of the label that was put on them.
What's the criticism? Because here I think there's a common denominator that I see in all of the protagonists of your history, in all of these different individuals, there's backlash, right? There's always backlash. Yeah. And in most cases, it ends, if it doesn't end their career, it severely undermines it, right? And in Brera's case, I think it basically, right, it leads the organization to close, right? De facto, at least.
It's one of the factors.
Its operations. Yeah. And but what are the reactions? Because this is, I think, striking. And here, maybe we can bring the conversation back to contemporary times. How are they viewed by the American Jewish Committee for saying the things that they're saying? Which again is with a few exceptions here. The example of Brera is the two-state solution, something which is kind of in the consensus or has been up until recently.
Well, it wasn't a consensus back then, in the 70s, but it became in the consensus. Look, these were people who positioned themselves as nice Jewish kids. Many of them considered themselves Zionists. They went to all the camps. They went to the American Jewish camp. They were parts of these. Many of them are in these very Zionist movements. And they're portrayed as self-hating Jews, Jews for Fatah, like
Raiders.
basically, yeah. So there's some anti-Zionist Jews like Sharon Rose, and basically they're saying this person knew someone who is friends with Sharon Rose, so they all have the same position, and basically that you can't choose one or the other. That you, if you're not sort of for Israel, it's like you're helping the enemy, and so yeah, and so there's no sort of space for that, and really. The JDL and the Kahanists, they're there, American Kahanists are protesting. And, when Mati Peled, who is a general, says something sort of pro-peace, American Jews can't criticize him so easily because he's a general. But when an American Jew says the same thing, they can say, oh, look, you don't serve in the army. Oh, what are you talking about? Even if that person, that American Jew, spent 3 years on a kibbutz, it doesn't matter. So they're ripped apart. And some of these people leave the American Jewish community involvement. Some become more involved in the long run, but it was emotionally traumatic to go through that rejection when you feel like everything you're doing is trying to help the Jewish world, and you get, sort of destroyed by it. And so that's the story that we see of a lot of these people. And so you get the sense that maybe the American Jewish community is weaker because of the people that it kind of chewed up.
So just, I know, Judith, I just have one follow-up, and then maybe if you have something, then we can take a few questions, because I see at least 2-3 questions from the audience already. So I have a question that, to elaborate what you just raised, and it's about comparing then and now. And one of the things that are so important, I think, to understand, almost all the characters and the organizations that you're talking about in the book who are voicing dissent in the 50s, 60s, even 70s, they are not what we would call today anti-Israel by any means, right? Many of them believe in a two-state solution. Many of them are Zionists, right? Like you mentioned, Williams Zuckerman and Don Peretz. They believe in the Jewish state's right to exist. And that's a really important point that it's really important, I think, to establish. They feel that Israel would be better off, it would be more secure, right? Not just morally would be more virtuous, but it would be more secure if the Palestinian refugee problem was addressed and resolved and recognized. And what strikes me, if you compare those first 2 generations of Jewish American, I don't want to call them maybe critics, but they're certainly not anti-Zionists. They're actually Zionists. You call the book Our Palestine Question, right? And very smartly so, I think, because they see it as a question that they, as Jews who support Israel, needed to deal with. So when you compare those 2 generations and their dissent over Israel to what's happening now, right? And kind of the, Jewish Voices for Peace, but not only, a lot of the organizations, obviously, this is a very different story. Their position on Israel, I think, is would be considered certainly anti-Zionist in a way that the earlier generations wouldn't have even kind of pondered.
Yeah. Well, of course, this book would be so different if it came out on October 6th, or that different world. I think there are a lot of these organizations, like If Not Now, were founded by people who, like Don Peretz, and like a lot of them, spent a lot of time over there.
Yeah.
And a lot of the American Jews who've been critical, and I'm talking about J Street, which, as well, people who essentially, and became extremely provocative. I mean, I don't know if people know much about J Street in Israel, but is a pro-state, two-state solution group. That, again, it's become a little more mainstream now, but became under intense sort of scrutiny when it first came out 10, 15 years ago. So I think there's similarities in between a lot of the people who are critical of Israel now and Israel then that actually do have a lot of engagement. I think more American Jews now.
A lot of what? I didn't hear.
I think a lot of engagement. And I'll expand on that. American Jews, so I'm 34, but people my age and younger, millennials, Gen Z, we have more exposure than any other American Jewish generation to Israel. People have gone on birthright. People can read Haaretz and Times of Israel and 972 every day. Netflix, all the series, all the camp, summer camp, Shlichim and Hillel. And so I think there's an intense connection and exposure to Israel, but there's also a more intense connection and exposure to Palestinians. And so you have more people seeing and being morally challenged about what's going on. Yeah. I think for a lot of American Jews...
okay. Yeah. No, because you're right. No. You mentioned the sociologist here, there's Assan. And at the end, he says that growing American Jewish criticism of Israel has emerged not as a result of greater distance from Israel, but rather from growing American Jewish proximity to it. A larger part. So it's like what you're saying. I mean, it's much more people come to Israel, and they're, I think, today very concerned about what's happening in Israel, not because they don't like Israel or they don't want, but it's they think that the solution for Israel also is 2 states. That's my...
A lot of them do. I mean, I can't speak for everyone who's at the protest, but there's lots of people who aren't. There's lots for every person who's going on at the bridge and protesting. There's lots of more people who are American Jews who have very complicated, very, very complicated feelings. I think we're seeing also in the US images that lots of Israelis aren't about what's going on in Gaza. And a lot of us have Palestinians who are classmates or friends. And so it's, again, American Jews are also having more knowledge and understanding and contact with Palestinians. And there's a divide that sort of I don't focus on because I'm focused on so many other things archivally. But look, I mean, for American Jews, so much of what American Jewish identity is, it's about being a minority. It's, it's about being the only kid in your classroom who's not celebrating Christmas. And it's about the history of Jews getting kicked out from one country to another. So, the fact that the Palestinian issue is, resonant is, again, and then there's also this close relationship with Zionism and this idea of the need for Jewish statehood. So I think a lot of American Jews are figuring out how to process, a lot of Jews everywhere, what it means to be a Jew vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And this used to be in 1959, maybe an issue you could ignore more. And now you can. I mean, there were never all American Jews were ignoring it. Don Peretz wasn't. But suddenly you need to confront these things. And people see, the mass deaths in Gaza, and some feel like it's essential to do anything they can to stop that. I mean, there's a bigger geopolitical context, of course, but I think a lot of people who are protesting and who are not, or pro-Israel or pro-Palestine or American Jewish, have a lot of feelings going on right now, to say the least.
I think, and maybe just because we're running out of time, so maybe we'll take a few questions, right, that we have. But I think what the last comment is so important, because it's if the book teaches us anything, and here I think it allows us to walk away, distance ourselves from the binaries of pro-Israel, anti-Israel, pro-Palestine, anti-Palestine, because all of the figures in your book, again, they're trying, it's that disappearing center. They're trying to, in a way that they care about Israel, they believe in Zionism. And here, I think for me, it's a big difference, at least with some of the voices we hear now who are, calling for the total delegitimization of Israel as a Jewish state. And none of these figures are like that. Maybe Elmer Berger, but I'm not even sure.
A few, Elmer Berger, yeah.
So maybe him, but people who believe in the right of the Jewish state to exist, yet also believe, and it's always that nuance that there also has to be a way to accommodate Palestinian statehood, because that's the only way for both of the nations to exist, in a dignified and in a secure manner. All right. So
I also believe in this, so I understand them.
Yeah, but that nuance isn't that nuance isn't allowed to exist during, and then you have, not a surprise, you end up in a much more polarized situation.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And the book, I think, demonstrates why that there's no space for nuance. So there's a few questions here from the audience. Let's get a few questions in. One is it's a question. This is some of the students that they emailed us the questions. One is how representative are the figures in your book who are voicing dissent, in the 50s and 60s, of the broader American community? Because I think there's some statistics that you show. I think 80% or something are are very pro-Zionist and pro-Israel, but how representative are these voices of the broader Jewish American community?
Yeah, they're not, and I don't, and I want to always make clear that I don't really claim that, even though some people might think that. So I think most American Jews weren't thinking really about these issues very much at all. The American Jewish Committee is super influential in terms of, again, it considers itself non-Zionist but supportive of Israel, so it's trying to maintain a neutral position, and it's the one who can get the meetings with the president. But it's Zionist groups like Hadassah, they're much bigger. And again, most American Jews most people aren't thinking deeply about deep issues that much in general, not just the Jewish. But and so there's not a ton of sort of engagement. I'd say you have such a small number of people who are exposed to these issues. Like Don Peretz is literally there. He's in a village where people were kicked out of their homes in 1949. You know, he's and there's not lots of people like him. Brera, I think by the 70s, it's less uncommon. You know, it has 1,500 members, which is not a lot, but they represented a lot of those people were heads of Hillel chapters in the 70s. And so I think beneath the surface, if people actually heard what they were saying and actually, you know, read the books and thought through things, I think there would have been more support for these sorts of positions. But they weren't really allowed to really circulate in a way before being labeled sort of as anti-Jewish or the enemy. So what's interesting though is I don't think, you know, people talk about American Jews. Oh, you know, sort of had someone post this out the other day. Most American Jews are Zionists. What does that even mean? We don't have a poll where we see that actual question. Most American Jews support Israel existing, definitely. But what does it mean to be Zionist? And this is a question we don't actually talk about much in the American Jewish community and don't talk about then or now. And so I think it's really hard to say where most American Jews are when there aren't when they're not these conversations or polling questions on the other hand. So I'll put that all out there.
Do you want to take some of the audience questions here? I see we have quite a few on the chat.
I have one from Ziv Robinovich, so I don't know if you asked it. He writes like this: Jeff, in the 1970s, Israel was changing and the right was on the rise. And eventually in 1977, Begin and Likud came to power. The leftist figures you just mentioned were losing impact in Israel. How did the US Jewish figures you studied refer to Begin's ideas of autonomy?
Yeah. So Begin is like, you know, none of them, like the vast majority of American Jewish establishment, didn't like him. They viewed him as not quite fascist, but not very unfavorably. The American Jewish leadership was very comfortable with the Labor Pie establishment. But then suddenly he gets elected and they adjust. They adjust quite quickly. I mean, this also happened in the context of Camp David, and peace with Egypt. But suddenly this figure who in a lot of the American Jewish press was viewed very unfavorably was sort of normalized. In terms of the American Jewish left, the whole election and then Camp David was extremely confusing because you have American Jews, and you saw a little bit of this in the Abraham Accords. You have American Jews saying the Palestinian question needs to be answered so that there can be peace in the Middle East. And there's a move with Begin and toward peace with Egypt without the Palestinian question being resolved through statehood. And you have later other peace agreements or normalization agreements. And so it seemed to prove at certain points that addressing Palestinian rights was not, or national rights or whatever, is not essential. But of course, then you have moments like, you know, intifadas or the war, this war that shows that the Palestinian issue isn't just going to, you know, disappear.
Okay.
So I maybe
do we have another? Sorry.
Yeah, there's a few more questions. I apologize to the audience that we won't have time for all of them, but maybe I'll just read one last one. And it's the question of a missed opportunity. And that strikes me, it's something I also felt while reading the book. And it's a sense that is it possible that, you know, when you're going through the historical narrative and you're writing it, and that there's a missed opportunity here in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, before 67 kind of changes everything, that maybe the Jewish American community, if it had, you know, absorbed at least some of these ideas and maybe developed an attitude which is a bit more, I don't want to say neutral, but a bit more considerate or open, with the space to also acknowledge some of the critiques of Israel that were being voiced. Do you think at that moment, you know, maybe, and again, this is the question you never ask a historian, but I'm going to ask it anyway, right? That counterfactual history of had these voices, had people been listening to them within the Jewish American community, could things have maybe turned out differently, right? Before kind of the, you know, the post-67 special relationship is really consolidated.
Yeah, I think American Jewish discourse would be in a healthier state, in terms of there being, I mean, look, reading back when these problems seem less painful and there was less decades of violence and everything, it feels very sad reading parts of the book, and thinking about what could have been. I mean, these are such narrow stories, actually, what I'm writing, and maybe, but is actually it's a question that maybe needs to be dealt with more in a diplomatic and political realm. Don Parrott's best friend, Philip Matar, is working with Neil Kaplan on a new book looking at what he's called missed opportunities. And I think some of those might go hand in hand with, you know, what I'm writing about. But I think it's clear that the American Jewish community could have played a more helpful role in sort of in this than they did. But ultimately, these are decisions that are going to be made by people in the Middle East. And so in a way, it's a little bit discouraging for activists and sort of the limits, but American Jews can play a role, but there's, you know, bigger things and other players who have even more at stake.
Judith, final thoughts?
Well, okay. First of all, our time is up, and I would like to thank you very much, Geoffrey, for this. It was like even moving, an exciting and a moving conversation we had with you about your book. And it's an important book for me also, not only because you bring to light past figures and organizations and, you know, all the history of the last decades, but it is also something, you know, like, I don't know how to say it. It's like maybe there will be still a hope, you know, I don't know, after the war or even a little bit during the war, for trying again all kinds of, even, you know, even American Jews and us to find some kind of a solution for the Israel-Palestine problem, and maybe we'll find peace. And it was really moving to read about it and about all your characters. So thank you very much. I enjoyed the book very much, and I hope that other people will buy it and will enjoy it too. And okay, so thank you very much, and good evening.
Thank you so much for reading and engaging with us. And
Okay, all right, thank you. All right,
bye.
Good evening. Thank you, Mom.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Make it. What are we doing now?